The world knew Ace Frehley as Kiss's Space Ace, the silver-painted guitar god who set his instrument on fire every night. But in Tokyo, March 1977, something happened that nearly ended Kiss before they reached their peak. In a small basement bar in Roppongi, surrounded by geishas and sake bottles, Ace made a decision that would haunt Gene Simmons for decades. What he whispered to that bartender at 4 a.m. would have destroyed everything Kiss had built. But before that night changed everything. Before Ace stood at the crossroads between East and West, there was the plane ride. 14 hours above the Pacific Ocean, and Ace Frehley was already planning his escape. Gene Simmons sat 3 rows ahead, counting projected merchandise revenue in his notebook, completely unaware that his lead guitarist was about to discover a place where Space Ace wasn't just a character, but a religion. The stewardess noticed Ace's hands shaking as she served his 5th Jack Daniels. She had no idea she was watching a man falling in love with a country he'd never seen. Before we dive deeper into this story, if you're fascinated by the untold truths behind rock's greatest legends, subscribe to our channel. Because what happened in Tokyo that spring would redefine everything Ace thought he knew about fame, identity, and belonging. To understand why Tokyo hit Ace Frehley like a spiritual earthquake, you have to go back to the Bronx. Paul Daniel Frehley grew up in a neighborhood where survival meant being invisible, where showing emotion was weakness, where dreaming beyond your block was dangerous. His father, Carl, an electrician with calloused hands and zero tolerance for nonsense, had drilled into young Ace a simple philosophy. Keep your head down, do your work, don't ask for attention. Rock and roll was Carl's nightmare. A guitar was a waste of money. Fame was for fools. When Ace joined Kiss in 1973, he brought that Bronx armor with him. While Gene Simmons built an empire of self-promotion and Paul Stanley crafted his star persona, Ace retreated behind the silver makeup. Space Ace wasn't just a character, it was a fortress. The makeup allowed him to be seen without being known. The costume let him perform without being vulnerable. And for 4 years, it worked perfectly. Kiss exploded across America, their faces on lunchboxes and comic books, their concerts becoming pyrotechnic religious experiences. But inside that silver mask, Paul Daniel Frehley was suffocating. By early 1977, Kiss was the biggest rock band on the planet. The Rock and Roll Over album had gone platinum. The touring schedule was relentless. 72 cities in 6 months. Every night, Ace would paint his face, strap on his Les Paul, and become someone else. Every morning, he'd scrub off the makeup and face a mirror that reflected a stranger. The alcohol consumption that started as backstage relaxation had evolved into morning necessity. The groupies that once seemed like perks now felt like transactions. And Gene Simmons's endless business meetings, his merchandising obsessions, his treatment of the band as a brand rather than brothers, was eating away at whatever remained of Ace's enthusiasm. Then came the Japan announcement. 3 weeks in Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. Gene framed it as a conquest, another market to dominate. Paul saw it as validation of their global reach. Peter Criss just wanted to get paid. But Ace, reading about Japan in a battered travel guide he'd bought at JFK, felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Curiosity. The photos of neon-lit streets, ancient temples coexisting with modern chaos, a culture built on honor and aesthetics, stirred something deep in his Bronx-hardened heart. Maybe in a place where everything was different, he could be different too. The moment Ace stepped off the plane at Narita Airport, he knew this wasn't going to be another tour. The air felt different, charged with an energy he couldn't name. but it was the fans that stopped his heart. 3,000 people pressed against barriers, screaming not just for Kiss, but specifically for him. They held signs in broken English, "Space Ace, we love you forever," and "Frehley-san, our guitar god." Their faces weren't painted like American fans, mimicking the band's makeup. These fans looked at Ace with something beyond adoration. It was reverence, the kind reserved for masters of a craft, for artists who'd achieved transcendence. In the limousine heading into Tokyo, Gene immediately started complaining about the narrow streets and the challenges of moving equipment. Paul worried about whether Japanese audiences would understand their show. Peter fell asleep, but Ace pressed his face against the window, watching the city unfold like a living contradiction. Ancient wooden buildings stood beside glass skyscrapers. Businessmen in perfect suits bowed to each other with choreographed precision. Neon signs and indecipherable characters turned the twilight streets into corridors of light. And everywhere, music. Not just rock, but layers of sound, traditional shamisen melodies mixing with Western pop, creating something entirely new. The hotel was chaos. Fans camped outside. Journalists demanded interviews. Gene scheduled back-to-back promotional appearances. But late that first night, when everyone else had crashed from jet lag, Ace slipped out a service entrance. He had no plan, no destination, just an overwhelming need to walk these streets without the makeup, without the entourage, without being Space Ace. Just Paul Frehley from the Bronx, trying to understand why this place felt more like home than home ever had. But what Ace discovered in those narrow Roppongi alleys would change everything. Because Tokyo didn't just welcome him, it understood him. To fully grasp what Tokyo offered Ace, you need to understand what America had taken from him. By 1977, Kiss wasn't a band anymore. It was a corporation. Gene Simmons, with his Machiavellian business instincts, had transformed four musicians into a merchandising phenomenon. Lunchboxes, action figures, makeup kits, pinball machines. Gene saw unlimited potential. Ace saw his face being sold in toy aisles, his identity mass-produced and distributed to children who'd never heard him play a single note. The creative process had become assembly line production. Gene and Paul dominated songwriting, their partnership excluding Ace and Peter from meaningful artistic input. When Ace brought song ideas to the table, Gene would smile that reptilian smile and say, "Great, Ace, we'll consider it for the next album," which was code for never. The studio sessions that should have been collaborative explorations became efficiency exercises. Get in, record your parts, get out. Ace's guitar solos, once improvised expressions of raw emotion, were now timed to the second, analyzed for commercial viability, edited to fit radio formats. The touring was systematic brutality. Wake up in a hotel room indistinguishable from yesterday's, bus to venue, sound check with the same technical problems, dressing room with the same arguments, makeup application that now felt like putting on a prison uniform, show that followed the same set list, the same stage movements, the same pyrotechnic cues, after party with the same industry parasites, hotel room with a different groupie wearing the same desperate expression. Pass out. Repeat. 150 dates a year. Every city blurred into the next. Every arena crowd sounded the same. Every morning, Ace looked in the mirror and saw less of himself. The isolation was existential. Ace had a wife, Jeanette, back in New York, but their phone conversations had devolved into transactional updates. Kids okay, bills paid, see you next month? Maybe. The distance wasn't just geographical. Jeanette had married a struggling guitarist with dreams. She was now married to a brand, a masked performer who came home smelling like smoke and strangers, who flinched when she turned on lights, who spent more time with his guitar than his family. But Tokyo didn't care about any of that. Tokyo saw something America had stopped seeing, and on the second night of the tour, in a tiny guitar shop in Shibuya, Ace would discover exactly what that was. The shop owner, an elderly man named Tanaka-san, recognized Ace immediately despite the absence of makeup. What he said would make Ace cry for the first time in a decade. The first Kiss concert in Japan was at the Budokan, a venue that held sacred status in rock history. The Beatles had played there. Deep Purple had recorded there. And on March 19, 1977, Kiss was about to discover what real devotion looked like. American crowds were loud, chaotic, fueled by beer and testosterone. Japanese crowds were something else entirely. They stood in perfect formation. They clapped in unison. And when Ace launched into his guitar solo during Deuce, the entire arena fell into absolute silence, 13,000 people holding their collective breath, listening with an attention that bordered on meditation. Ace felt it immediately. This wasn't just entertainment to them. This was art. They weren't screaming for Space Ace the character. They were honoring Ace Frehley, the musician. Every note he played was received with the gravity of a classical performance. When he hit the final sustained note of his solo, bending the string until it screamed, the crowd's applause was thunderous but controlled, respectful, acknowledging mastery rather than just volume. For the first time in years, Ace felt seen. Not the makeup, not the costume. Him. The kid from the Bronx who'd spent 10,000 hours learning to make a guitar sing. The days between concerts became Ace's real education. While Gene scheduled business meetings and Paul did promotional appearances, Ace disappeared into Tokyo's labyrinth. He discovered tiny bars in Shinjuku, where salarymen drank shochu and listened to American blues records with religious intensity. He visited guitar shops in Koenji, where craftsmen spent months building single instruments, treating each piece of wood like sacred material. He stumbled into a jazz club in Roppongi, where a 70-year-old saxophonist played with technique that made Ace weep. But it was the language barrier that became Ace's unexpected liberation. Because when you can't speak, you're forced to listen. And what Ace heard in Tokyo's silence was deafening. In those wanderings, Ace began noticing patterns. Japanese culture operated on principles completely alien to his American experience, but somehow deeply familiar to his artist soul. There was wabi-sabi, the acceptance of imperfection and impermanence, which explained why his rough edges were celebrated rather than criticized. There was shokunin, the artisan's devotion to craft over commerce, which validated his obsession with tone and technique that Gene dismissed as unmarketable perfectionism. One afternoon, in that Shibuya guitar shop, Tanaka-san watched Ace play a 1959 Les Paul for 20 minutes. When Ace finally stopped, hands trembling from emotion and effort, the old man bowed deeply and said through his granddaughter's translation, "In America, you are famous. In Japan, you are respected. These are not same thing. Famous is what people give you. Respect is what you earn. You have earned." Then Tanaka-san pulled out a box from behind the counter. Inside was a hand-carved guitar pick made from rare wood, inscribed with characters that translated to "The Quiet One speaks through strings." He pressed it into Ace's palm and refused payment. Ace left that shop and walked for hours, clutching that pick, understanding for the first time why he felt so displaced in his own success. America had made him famous, but fame was a prison. Fame meant satisfying others' expectations, maintaining an image, feeding a machine. Respect was different. Respect acknowledged the human behind the performance, the thousands of hours of practice, the sacrifice, the devotion. Japan offered respect without demanding anything in return. But Gene was watching. And Gene understood that what Ace was experiencing in Tokyo was more dangerous than any drug addiction. Because Ace was discovering he didn't need Kiss. And that realization could destroy everything. On the 12th night of the tour, after a concert in Osaka that left Ace emotionally drained, he returned to Tokyo alone. The band had scattered. Gene flew to Hong Kong for business meetings. Paul took a group to Kyoto. Peter disappeared with a local woman. Ace checked into a small ryokan in Asakusa, far from the tour's luxury hotels, and spent the day walking until his feet blistered. He ended up in Roppongi, in a basement establishment called Blue Note Tokyo. The bar was nearly empty. Just a few serious drinkers and a mama-san who looked like she'd weathered every imaginable storm. Ace sat at the corner, ordered sake, and for the first time in years, allowed himself to think clearly about his life. The thoughts came in devastating waves. He was 26 years old and already felt ancient. He had money, fame, success by every measure, and was profoundly miserable. His marriage was a legal formality. His friendships within Kiss had devolved into business partnerships. His artistic voice was owned by a corporation that valued his image more than his music. And Space Ace had become more real than Paul Frehley, consuming the human beneath the silver paint. Tokyo offered an alternative he'd never imagined possible. He could stay, learn the language, study with Japanese guitar masters, play small clubs where music mattered more than spectacle, build a life where respect replaced fame, where craft replaced commerce. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and intoxicating. Walking away from Kiss at their commercial peak would be insane. It would also be the sanest thing he'd ever done. The mama-san, whose name was Keiko, noticed his distress. Her granddaughter was visiting that night and translated their conversation. Keiko asked Ace a question that hit like a physical blow. When you put on makeup, do you become more yourself or less yourself? Ace tried to answer but couldn't. The question had no answer, or perhaps too many answers, all of them painful. They talked for hours, Ace spilling truths he'd never voiced aloud. The suffocation of success, the loss of identity, the fear that he'd traded his soul for a cartoon version of himself. Keiko listened with profound patience, never interrupting. When Ace finally fell silent, exhausted, Keiko spoke with devastating simplicity. You came to Japan to remember who you were before you became famous, but now you're afraid because you remember, and America will not let you be that person again. The statement hung in the air like smoke, impossible to clear. Because Keiko was right, and Ace knew what he had to do. At 4 a.m, with too much sake in his system but mind somehow clearer than it had been in years, Ace made his decision. He would leave Kiss. Not immediately, not dramatically, but strategically. He'd fulfill tour obligations, he'd be professional, but he would start reclaiming his artistic autonomy, rebuilding Paul Frehley while letting Space Ace fade. Tokyo had given him permission to want something different. He told the bartender in broken English mixed with gesture that he was going to leave the biggest rock band in the world because Japan had taught him that fame without respect was just noise. The bartender smiled, wrote something on a napkin, and slid it across. The characters translated to, "The bravest warriors know when to stop fighting." But Gene Simmons didn't build an empire by letting assets walk away. When he discovered what happened that night in Roppongi, his response would be calculated, ruthless, and ultimately effective. Because Gene understood something Ace was too naive to realize. You can leave Kiss, but Space Ace would never let you go. The confrontation happened 3 days later in a Tokyo hotel suite. Gene had flown back early, Paul with him. They knew. Tokyo's network of connections had carried Ace's confession straight to Gene's ears. Gene didn't yell. His rage was cold, mathematical. So you want to quit? After everything we've built? You want to throw it away because some Japanese people were nice to you? Paul stood by the window, looking more hurt than angry. Ace tried to explain what Tokyo had awakened in him, but the words came out wrong, sounding ungrateful. Gene let him stumble, then delivered his counteroffer with surgical precision. You can't leave. Legally, you're bound by contracts through 1980. Financially, walking away would bankrupt you. Professionally, the industry would blacklist you. But personally, Ace, I think you're just scared. That last part was the knife. You're scared that without Kiss, without the makeup, you're just Paul Frehley from the Bronx who never made it. Those Japanese fans weren't respecting you, Ace. They were respecting Kiss. Try leaving. See how fast they forget you. The words hit their target. Because underneath Ace's awakening was terror. Terror that Gene was right. Terror that without Kiss, he was nothing. Terror that his skills weren't actually special. Tokyo had felt like liberation, but maybe it was just another delusion. Paul tried a softer approach. We hear you. You need creative input. You want a solo project. Fine. We'll all do solo albums. But you don't leave. We're brothers, Ace. Brothers don't abandon each other. The combination achieved its goal. Ace agreed to stay. Not forever, he told himself. Just until contracts expired. The solo album became the compromise, the release valve. But what none of them understood was that Ace's solo album would prove more successful than Kiss's group efforts. And that success would make his departure not just possible, but inevitable. The rest of the Japan tour was bittersweet. Ace performed with new intensity, trying to capture what Tokyo had given him. The final concert at Budokan felt like ceremony, Ace pouring everything into every note. When he played his final solo, he was saying goodbye to the possibility of a different life. The flight back to America was silent. Gene worked on notebooks, already planning containment strategy. Paul slept, crisis averted, and Ace drank, watching Japan disappear beneath clouds, feeling Tokyo slip away like water through fingers. He still had Tanaka-san's wooden pick in his pocket. He would carry it for the next 45 years. The 1978 solo album became the most successful of all 4 Kiss releases, and Tokyo's influence was embedded in every track. New York Groove became a hit, but Deep Cuts revealed something more interesting. Songs like Snowblind carried that Japanese aesthetic Ace had absorbed, the meaningful silence, the acceptance of imperfection. But success trapped him deeper in Kiss. Gene doubled down on merchandise. Paul pushed for tighter creative control. The dynamic became toxic, with Tokyo awakening creating permanent divide. The drinking that had subsided in Japan came roaring back with vengeance. By 1982, when Ace finally left Kiss, he wasn't the awakened artist who'd walked Tokyo streets. He was a broken man using substances to silence the voice whispering, "You should have stayed in Roppongi." Yet Tokyo never left him. Even in his darkest years, Ace kept that wooden pick. In interviews, when pressed about Kiss, Ace would mention Japan with wistfulness. "Tokyo understood something about me that America never did," he'd say. never elaborating. Real vindication came decades later. In 2009, when Ace released Anomaly at 58, sober and rebuilding, he'd finally integrated Tokyo's lessons. The album earned respect that Kiss's recent outputs couldn't match. Respect over fame, craft over commerce. In 2016, Ace returned to Japan for a solo tour. 40 years had passed. Tokyo had changed. The small bars were gone. Tanaka-san's shop was a convenience store. But the respect remained. At a press conference, a journalist asked the question everyone had avoided. "Mr. Frehley, you've said Japan changed your life in 1977. How?" And Ace told the truth. About Roppongi at dawn, about Keiko's question, about almost staying, about the decision that haunted him but ultimately shaped everything. Tokyo showed me that Space Ace and Paul Frehley didn't have to be enemies. In America, I thought I had to choose. Be the cartoon or be the real person. But Japan taught me that authenticity and performance aren't opposites when you're honest about who you are. Space Ace wasn't a mask hiding me. It was part of me. Japan respected that complexity. America just wanted me to pick one. The room fell into that Japanese silence that honors profound statements. Then genuine applause. One elderly journalist who'd been at the 1977 Budokan concert stood and bowed deeply. "Welcome home, Frehley-san. We never forgot." That night, Ace played a small Shibuya club. No makeup, no pyrotechnics, just Ace, his Les Paul, and 200 people. He pulled out the wooden pick he'd carried 40 years and held it up. "This represents the path I didn't take, but also the path that never left me. Everything I've become carries a piece of what Tokyo taught me. Respect over fame, craft over commerce, truth over image." He played Fractured Mirror, and in that performance was everything. The loneliness, the search, the integration. The audience listened with breathless attention. And in their silence, Ace finally heard what Tokyo had been saying all along. You were always enough. The makeup was optional. The machine was temporary. But the music from your hands and heart, that was eternal. Tokyo hadn't saved Ace Frehley in 1977. It planted a seed that took decades to grow, that survived alcohol and drugs and failure, that finally bloomed into wisdom. Space Ace was never the problem. America's inability to see beyond Space Ace was the problem. And Tokyo, understanding that masks reveal as much as they conceal, had offered Ace permission to be complex, contradictory, human. The 1977 tour didn't end anything. It began everything. Began Ace's walk toward integration. Began his understanding that authenticity isn't the absence of performance, but honesty within performance. Began his recognition that the Bronx Kid and the Space God weren't different people, but different expressions of the same yearning soul. And in the end, that's what Tokyo gave Ace Frehley. Not an escape, not a solution, but a mirror reflecting his full complexity with respect rather than judgment. A mirror he'd spend his life learning to look into without flinching. A mirror showing him that Space Ace's real power was never the makeup or costume or pyrotechnics. It was always just Paul Frehley holding a guitar, brave enough to be seen.